Threads of History, a podcast that aims to go back in time to connect an event or instance to its origin through several threads of continuity across time, space, culture, and historic moments. Welcome to the podcast. I am Mike Schellhammer. Today's episode covers the origin of the Black Death, its impact on populations across medieval Christian Europe, its influence on beliefs and the composition of the Roman Catholic Church, and its long-reaching effects on changes on the Catholic Church in Europe, and the kickoff of the Protestant Reformation. It was called the Black Death, Yersinia pestis, the plague, hell on earth, scourge of heaven, the end of days. The Black Death is widely believed to have been the result of plague caused by infection with the bacterium Yersinia pestis. Modern genetic analyses indicate that the strain of Y. pestis introduced during the Black Death is ancestral to all existing and circulating Y. pestis strains known to cause diseases in humans today. Hence, the origin of modern plague epidemics lies in the medieval period. What was the cause of the Black Death, and what did the outbreak look like? With hindsight, the pandemic can be traced to the Mongol Empire, which, in addition to conquering with its vast army enormous areas of Asia, opened and ensured the safety of the Silk Road for trade. This Pax Mongolica facilitated relatively rapid, long-distance transport both of people and diseases, as airplanes, ships, and railroads do today with sufferers of COVID-19. Where travel is highly restricted and populations are small, deadly diseases tend to burn themselves out fairly quickly. But where the disease can be spread easily to new areas with a new supply of victims, efforts to contain such pandemics are far more difficult. In medieval times, where the Mongol army went, so went the plague. Where the sailing ships carried trade and traders, the pestilence arrived in new regions. According to the contemporary account of Gabriel de Mussy, a turning point came when the Mongols besieged the trading city of Kaffa in the Crimean Peninsula between 1346 and 1347 AD. Having originated in China and Inner Asia, the Black Death decimated the army of the Kipchak Khan Jenabeg while he was besieging the Genoese trading port of Kaffa, now Feodosia, in the Crimean Peninsula in 1346 to 1347. Because the army remained in one place for so long, the Black Death had time to spread from man to man, or from rat-carried fleas to humans. With his forces disintegrating, Jenabeg catapulted plague-infested corpses into the town in an effort to infect his enemies, while his forces poisoned wells, which caused a sickening stench within the city walls. This strategy has been cited as the first instance of biological warfare in human history. From Kaffa, Genoese ships carried the plague westward to Mediterranean ports, where it quickly spread inland, affecting Sicily in the same year, North Africa, mainland Italy, Spain, and France the following year. A ship from Calais carried the plague to Dorset, England in August 1348. It reached Bristol almost immediately and spread rapidly throughout the southwestern counties of England. London suffered most violently between February and May of 1349, East Anglia and Yorkshire during that summer. Also suffering the effects of the plague were Austria, Hungary, Switzerland, Germany, and the Low Countries by the end of 1349. The Black Death reached the extreme north of England, Scotland, Scandinavia, and the Baltic countries the following year, 1350. Within 3 years, the Black Death had spread from Inner Asia to the Mediterranean to infect the entirety of Europe. The Black Death was so extreme that it's surprising even to scientists who are familiar with the details. According to medieval historian Philip de Leader, it is likely that over 4 years, starting in 1347, 45 to 50% of the European population died of plague. Modern estimates of medieval European population put that at 75 million to 200 million people dead in a few years' time. The pandemic moved fast. It often killed a host within days of them first developing symptoms. The symptoms included a fever of 100 to 106 degrees Fahrenheit, headaches, painful aching joints, nausea and vomiting, and a general feeling of malaise. The most widely caught variant was the bubonic plague, which produced these bubbles, or swellings in the armpits and groin, which turned black and eventually would burst, expelling bacteria and spreading the disease further. This disease spread through families, houses, villages, towns, and cities with terrifying speed and staggering mortality. 80% of the people who contracted the disease would die within 8 days. So many were struck down so rapidly, the Black Death killed indiscriminately. The disease took men, women, and children, rich and poor. Quoting a contemporary from the time, Giovanni Boccaccio, quote, "How many valiant men, how many fair ladies, breakfast with their kinfolk and the same night supped with their ancestors in the next world. The condition of the people was pitiable to behold. They, sickened by the thousands daily, and died unattended and without help. Many died in the open street, others dying in their houses, made it known by the stench of their rotting bodies. Consecrated churchyards did not suffice for the burial of the vast multitude of bodies, which were heaped by the hundreds in vast trenches, like goods in a ship hold, and covered with a little earth." Unquote. Monks, nuns, and priests were especially hard hit, since they cared for victims of the Black Death. However, there was no known number of church leaders and clerics who died during this period. We do know they predominantly suffered and died due to their exposure to so many of the sick. They did not have the modern hospital infrastructure to help deal with the pandemic, and the crisis only worsened as more became infected. There was no known cure for Y. pestis. What was the reaction to the Black Death? How did people react to this awful catastrophe? The governmental records of Italian cities present a mixed picture of the actions of civic leaders in the face of plague. In some areas, cities rapidly passed laws that attempted to prevent the entrance and spread of disease. They renewed sanitation laws designed to reduce the presence of miasma, or bad air, which medieval people believed caused disease. Thus, laws curtailed the activities of butchers, tanners, or others who worked with animal carcasses that could rot and produce miasma. The mobility of people and goods, such as wool and cloths that may trap the miasma, was restricted. Other laws regulated the location of burials and disposal of corpses. In other cities, however, it appears that government was reduced to an ineffective shadow, as officials died in huge numbers, and efforts to replace them could not keep up with the need for action. Church records have revealed the actions of ecclesiastical organizations. Bishops all over Europe consecrated new ground for burials and arranged intercessory processions. Priests were called to celebrate masses, give sermons, and lead their parishioners in processions of prayer to beg for merciful relief from the wrath of God, which was generally believed to have brought on the epidemic. Clerics urged all individuals to confess, be pertinent, and carry out acts of pious charity in order to pacify God. Thus, evidence can be found that the various communities in medieval Europe made strong attempts to counteract and deal with the crisis. The consequences of this violent catastrophe were many. The economic and social fabric of society was broken by this disease. A cessation of wars and a sudden slump in trade immediately followed, but were only of short duration. By 1351, the pandemic had died down, but whole villages and their fields were empty of inhabitants. Cottages and houses sat vacant. Many crops had rotted in the field for lack of labor to harvest them. Stock animals died, unfed and unwatered, for lack of human care. There were simply not enough serfs and peasants left to do the work. The aristocrats also died in droves. The medieval economic system broke down because of the rapid drop in population. A more lasting and serious consequence was the drastic reduction of the amount of land under cultivation, due once again to the deaths of so many laborers. This proved to be the ruin of many landowners. The shortage of labor compelled them to substitute wages or money rents in place of labor services in an effort to keep their tenants. There was also a general rise in wages for artisans and peasants. These changes brought in new shifts in the previously rigid stratification of society. Another consequence included psychological and spiritual effects to the people. The psychological effects of the Black Death were reflected north of the Alps, not in Italy, by a preoccupation with death and the afterlife invested in poetry, sculpture, and painting. The Roman Catholic Church lost some of its monopoly over the salvation of souls as people turned to mysticism and sometimes to moral excesses. I mean, why follow a God that does not save your country, your town, or your family from a deadly disease? For others, it had an opposite effect on their spirituality. Flagellants, belonging to the Brothers of the Cross, scourged themselves during the deadly pandemic, which they believed was punishment from God for people's sins. Driven by uber-Catholic zealotry, anti-Semitism greatly intensified throughout Europe. Jews were blamed for the spread of the Black Death. A wave of violent pogroms ensued, and entire Jewish communities were killed by mobs or burned at the stake en masse. Specifically, we can look at the example in the economy of Siena, Italy. The city's population was so diminished that the project of enlarging the cathedral was entirely abandoned, and the death of many great painters brought the development of the first Sienese school artistic movement to a premature end. The population of London was halved. There were 40,000 less settlements in Germany in 1400 than there were in 1345. It is clear, entire villages were wiped out. The family was the heart of medieval European society, and it was severely shaken by the Black Death. Many chroniclers and literary authors at the time described the actions of townspeople in terms of panic, fear, and flight. For medieval authors, the abandonment of children by their parents meant the specter of a society that had come unraveled at its core. It is important, therefore, to try to determine what really happened to children during the Black Death. We must remember that many medieval chroniclers were religious men who wrote with a moralizing message. It is possible that many wrote their accounts of events that happened in the world around them, not with the modern notion of objectivity reporting the facts, but instead to advise their readers to change their ways and lead more pious lives. Piousness measured potentially as whether or not parents would make sure their children were cared for after their passing, or whether or not parents abandoned their sick children in an attempt to outrun the plague and leave them to their dubious fate. We do not know whether parents or children themselves set about their own experience because there remain few letters and no diaries from this time. Parents who were dying of plague often wrote wills in which they provided for the future of their families as well as their own souls. The presence and contents of last wills and testaments during the pandemic can give us some indication as to whether parents were considering the fate of their children when they lay dying during the Black Death. There is no doubt that the Black Death led to the abandonment of children, whether by parents who died of the Black Death or by parents leaving their children hoping to survive the pestilence. Who would care for all of these orphaned children? The disintegrating local governments or the monarchy could not be expected to do anything productive with them. Just as the flagellants turned to their church for salvation from the plague, children were taken in by Catholic orphanages and monastic facilities. Remember, the church had been especially hit hard by the Black Death due to them often being tapped to care for the sick and suffered appalling mortality rates as a result. These children were not joining the Catholic orders to become nuns, monks, or priests. They joined in order to survive. This leads me to connect the deaths of pious Catholic priests, nuns, and monks, 50% or more of the Catholic Church's religious and clergy due to the Black Death, to their replacement by church clergy and leaders who would have joined not for pious devotion to the teachings of Christ, but for their own survival. And that attitude and acceptance of less than stellar leaders would eventually lead to the need for reform for more pious members of the church. When the plague hit in the mid 1300s, no one knew what caused this biblical pestilence. Some took it as divine punishment for the world's wicked ways, possibly the end of the world. Others blamed Jews, foreigners, travelers, and lepers, who were shunned and turned away where once they had been welcomed, or at least accepted. Some towns barricaded themselves in, afraid to let anyone in who was not already there, and equally afraid to let anyone out. Mothers abandoned husbands and children, and vice versa, for fear of catching the contagion. Sometimes houses were burned to the ground with the inhabitants inside if they were known to be ill. Ordinary parish burial grounds were insufficient to hold the massive numbers of the dead, and new plague cemeteries were opened. The most vulnerable part of the population, children, were abandoned during this time of social upheaval, leading them to become part of the Catholic Church hierarchy and eventually connect to the need for reform. And that reform would come in the form of the Protestant Reformation. Hammered into the door of a Catholic church in Wittenberg, in north-central Germany, on October 31st, 1517, by the Augustinian monk Martin Luther, was the document that would spring to life the Protestant Reformation and a total reorganization of Christian churches in Europe. Martin Luther's denunciation of the Catholic Church's doctrine and practices through this document triggered a series of proceedings that culminated in the Edict of Worms, a document that proclaimed him a heretic and declared war on Protestantism. But his actions had already set the Reformation in motion, which would introduce new religious, political, and economic trajectories to Europe and the world. Martin Luther was born on the 10th of November 1483. He was a German professor of theology, a priest, an author, a composer, and a former Augustinian monk. On the 2nd of July 1505, while Luther was returning to university on horseback after a trip home, a lightning bolt struck near him during a thunderstorm. Later telling his father he was terrified of death and divine judgment, he cried out, quote, "Help, St. Anna, I will become a monk," unquote. He came to view his cry for help as a vow he could never break. He left university, sold his books, and entered St. Augustine's monastery in Erfurt on 17th July 1505. One friend blamed the decision on Luther's sadness over the death of two friends. Luther himself seemed saddened by the move. Those who attended his farewell supper walked him to the door of the Black Cloister. Quote, "This day you see me, and then not ever again," unquote. Martin Luther is supposed to have said. His father was furious over what he saw as a waste of Luther's education. And so Luther dedicated himself to the Augustinian order, devoting himself to fasting, long hours of prayer, pilgrimage, and frequent confession. Luther described this period of his life as one of deep spiritual despair. He is supposed to have said, quote, "I lost touch with Christ the Savior and Comforter, and made of him the jailer and hangman of my poor soul," unquote. Johann von Staupitz, his superior, concluded that Luther needed more work to distract him from excessive introspection and ordered him to pursue an academic career. In 1507, Luther was ordained in Erfurt Cathedral. The following year, he began teaching theology at the University of Wittenberg. He received a bachelor's degree in biblical studies in 1508 and another bachelor's degree in the sentences in 1509. He was awarded his doctor of theology, and in 1512, he was received in the Senate of the Theological Faculty at the University of Wittenberg, having succeeded von Staupitz as chair of theology. He spent the rest of his career in this position at the University of Wittenberg. In 1516, Johann Tetzel, a Dominican friar, was sent to Germany by the Roman Catholic Church to sell indulgences to raise money in order to rebuild St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. Teitel's experiences as a preacher of indulgences, especially between 1503 and 1510, led to his appointment as general commissioner by Albrecht von Brandenburg, Archbishop of Mainz, who, deeply in debt to pay for a large accumulation of benefices, he had to contribute a considerable sum of 10,000 ducats toward the rebuilding of St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. Albrecht obtained permission from Pope Leo X to conduct the sale of a special plenary indulgence, which is the remission of a temporal punishment of sin, half of the proceeds of which Albrecht was to claim to pay the fees of his benefices. On the 31st of October 1517, Luther wrote to his bishop, Albrecht von Brandenburg. He protested against the sale of these indulgences. He enclosed in his letter a copy of his Disputation on the Power and Efficacy of Indulgences, which came to be known as the 95 Theses. Hans Hillerbrand writes that Luther had no intention of confronting the Church, but saw his disputation as a scholarly objection to Church practices, and the tone of the writing is accordingly searching rather than doctrinaire. Hillerbrand writes that there is nevertheless an undercurrent of challenge in several of the theses, particularly in Thesis 86, which asks, quote, "Why does the Pope, whose wealth today is greater than the wealth of the richest Crassus, build the Basilica of St. Peter with the money of poor believers rather than with his own money?" Unquote. Luther objected to a saying attributed to Tetzel that was, quote, "As soon as the coin in the coffer rings, the soul from purgatory springs." Unquote. Luther insisted that since forgiveness was God's alone to grant, those who claimed that indulgences absolved buyers from all punishments and granted them salvation were in error. Christians, he said, must not slacken in following Christ on account of such false assurances. This section is going to go into the weeds a little bit on Catholic teaching, so just fair warning. Catholic teaching states that when a person sins, they acquire the liability of guilt and the liability of punishment. A mortal sin, which is one that is grave or serious in nature and committed knowingly and freely, is considered to be an active refusal of connection with God, and to separate a person from God to the end of the suffering, the eternal death of hell, is an effect of this rejection, a consequence known as the eternal punishment of sin. The sacrament of penance removes this guilt and the liability of eternal punishment related to the mortal sin. Indulgences were introduced to allow for the remission of the severe penances of the early church, and granted at the intercession of Christians awaiting martyrdom, or at least imprisoned for the faith. The church teaches that indulgences draw on the treasury of merit, accumulated by Jesus' sacrifice on the cross, and the virtues and penances of the saints, and the saints literally named saints, famous Christians in the Catholic Church and the Catholic tradition from centuries past, but also in the general form, saints as in dead people that were Catholic Christians. They are granted for specific works and prayers in promotion to the devotion with which those good works and prayers are performed or recited. So that's what an indulgence is. In addition to the eternal punishment due to mortal sin, every sin, including venial sins, the more common, less severe sin, is a turning away from God through what the Catechism of the Catholic Church calls an unhealthy attachment to creatures, an attachment that must be purified either here on earth or after death in the state called purgatory. Catholic teaching states that the temporal punishment of sin should be accepted as a grace, and that the sinner should strive by works of mercy and charity, as well as by prayer and the various practices of penance, to put off completely the old man and put on the new man. So they're saying the old man being the sinning man, the new man being the one that is redeemed. The temporal punishment that follows sin is thus undergone either during life on earth or in purgatory. In this life, as well as by patient acceptance of sufferings and trials, the necessary cleansing from attachment to creatures may, at least in part, be achieved by turning to God in prayer and penance, and by works of mercy and charity. The indulgences from the Latin verb indulgere, meaning to forgive or to be lenient toward, are a help towards achieving this purification. An indulgence does not forgive the guilt of sin, nor does it prove release from the eternal punishment associated with unforgivable mortal sins. The Catholic Church teaches that indulgences relieve only the temporal punishment resulting from the effect of sin, the effect of rejecting God, the source of good, and that a person is still required to have their grave sins absolved, ordinarily through the sacrament of confession, in order to receive salvation. Similarly, an indulgence is not a permit to commit sin, a pardon of future sin, nor a guarantee of salvation for oneself or for another. Ordinarily, forgiveness of mortal sins is obtained through confession, also known as the sacrament of penance or reconciliation. Indulgences became increasingly popular in the Middle Ages as a reward for displaying piety and doing good deeds, though, doctrinally speaking, the Catholic Church stated that the indulgence was only valid for temporal punishment. The faithful asked that indulgences be given for saying their favorite prayers, doing acts of devotion, attending places of worship, and going on pilgrimage. Good deeds included charitable donations of money for a good cause, and money thus raised was used for many causes, both religious and civil. Building projects funded by indulgences included churches, hospitals, leper colonies, schools, roads, and bridges. However, the abuse of indulgences, mainly through commercialization, had become a serious problem which the Church recognized but was unable to restrain effectively. Some commissaries sought to extract the maximum amount of money for each indulgence. Professional pardoners, who were sent to collect alms for a specific project, practiced this unrestricted sale of indulgences. Many of these pardoners exceeded official church doctrine and promised rewards such as salvation from eternal damnation in return for money. With the permission of the Church, indulgences also became a way for Catholic rulers to fund expensive projects, such as the Crusades and cathedrals, by keeping a significant portion of the money raised from indulgences in their lands. There was a tendency to forge documents declaring that indulgences had been granted. Indulgences grew in extraordinary magnitude in terms of longevity and breadth of forgiveness. Church councils attempted to suppress some abuses connected with indulgences, spelling out time limits, but these limits were widely exceeded. False documents were circulated with indulgences surpassing all bounds, indulgences of hundreds or even thousands of years. In 1392, more than a century before Martin Luther published the 95 Theses, Pope Boniface IX wrote to the Bishop of Ferrara condemning the practice of certain members of religious orders who falsely claimed that they were authorized by the Pope to forgive all sorts of sins, and obtained money from the simple-minded faithful by promising them perpetual happiness in this world and eternal glory in the next. An engraving by Israel van Mechelen of the Mass of St. Gregory contained an indulgence of 20,000 years. One of the copies of this plate was altered in a later state to increase it to 45,000 years. The image of the Mass of St. Gregory had been especially associated with large indulgences since the Jubilee year of 1350 in Rome, when it was at least widely believed that an indulgence of 14,000 years had been granted for praying in the presence of the Man of Sorrows, a popular pilgrimage destination in the Basilica of Santa Croce in Rome. The abuse of indulgences would not be abated, so according to one account, Luther nailed his 95 Theses to the door of Castle Church in Wittenberg on the 31st of October, 1517. Scholars contend that the story of the posting on the door, even though it was settled as one of the pillars of history, they disagree if the act has a solid foundation in truth. So he might not have actually done it. The Latin Theses were printed in several locations in Germany in 1517. In January 1518, friends of Luther translated the 95 Theses from Latin into German. Within 2 weeks, copies of the Theses had spread throughout Germany. Luther's writings circulated widely, reaching France, England, and Italy as early as the following year, 1519. Students thronged to Wittenberg to hear Luther speak. He published a short commentary on Galatians and his work on the Psalms. 3 of his best-known works were published in 1520, To the Christian Nobility of the German Nation, on the Babylonian captivity of the church, and on the freedom of a Christian. Martin Luther came to reject several teachings and practices of the Roman Catholic Church. In particular, as we have noted, he disputed the view on indulgences. Luther proposed an academic discussion on the practice and efficacy of indulgences. His refusal to renounce all of his writings at the demand of Pope Leo X in 1520 and the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V at the Diet of Worms in 1521 resulted in his excommunication by the Pope and condemnation as an outlaw by the Holy Roman Emperor. Luther taught that salvation and consequently eternal life are not earned by good deeds, but are received only as the free gift of God's grace through the believer's faith in Jesus Christ as a Redeemer from sin. His theology challenged the authority and office of the Pope by teaching that the Bible is the only source of divinely revealed knowledge, and opposed the holy priesthood as being the only source of connection to God for the faithful. Those who identify with these and all of Luther's wider teachings are called Lutherans, though Luther insisted on Christian or evangelical as the only acceptable names for individuals who professed Christ. Luther's translation of the Bible into the German vernacular instead of Latin made it more accessible to the wider population, an event that had a tremendous impact on both the church and German culture. It fostered the development of a standard version of the German language, added several principles to the art of translation, and influenced the writing of an English translation. His hymns influenced the development of singing in Protestant churches. His marriage to Katharina von Bora, a former nun, set a model for the practice of clerical marriage, allowing Protestant clergy to marry. The effects of the 95 Theses and the ensuing Protestant Reformation are wide-reaching and significant. In his 95 Theses, Martin Luther attacked the indulgence system, insisting that the Pope had no authority over purgatory and that the doctrine of the merits of the saints had no foundation in the gospel. Here lay the key to Luther's concerns for the ethical and theological reform of the Church. Scripture alone is authoritative, and justification is by faith, not by works. While he did not intend to break with the Catholic Church, a confrontation with the papacy was not long in coming. In 1521, Luther was excommunicated, and what began as an internal spiritual reform movement had become a fracture in Western Christendom, leading to political and social reform. Several new Christian sects sprang up, some with only tertiary connections to Luther and his primary problems with Roman Catholicism. Luther was unable to stifle radicalism further afield. Preachers such as Thomas Müntzer and Zwickau prophet Nicholas Storch found support among poorer townspeople and peasants between 1521 and 1525. Spiritual conflicts were common after the 95 Theses. The Protestant Reformation spawned many different reform movements and religious groups across Europe. The Reformation movement within Germany diversified almost immediately, and other reform impulses arose independently of Luther. Huldrych Zwingli, which is a great name, built a Christian theology in Zurich in which church and state joined for the service of God. Zwingli agreed with Luther in the centrality of the doctrine of justification by faith, but he espoused a different understanding of the Holy Communion. Luther had rejected the Catholic Church's doctrine of transubstantiation, according to which the bread and wine in Holy Communion became the actual body and blood of Christ. According to Luther's notion, the body of Christ was physically present in the elements because Christ is present everywhere, while Zwingli claimed that entailed a spiritual presence of Christ and a declaration of faith by the recipients. Another group of reformers, often though not altogether correctly referred to as radical reformers, insisted that baptism be performed not on infants, but on adults who had professed their faith in Jesus. Called Anabaptists, they remained a marginal phenomenon in the 16th century, but survived despite fierce prosecution, as Mennonites and Hutterites in the 21st century. Opponents of the ancient Trinitarian dogma made their appearance as well. Known as Socinians, after the name of their founder, they established flourishing congregations, especially in Poland. Another important form of Protestantism is Calvinism, named after John Calvin, a French lawyer who fled France after his conversion to the Protestant cause. In Basel, Switzerland, Calvin brought out the first edition of his Institutes of the Christian Religion in 1536. the first systematic theological treatise on the new Reform movement. Calvin agreed with Luther's teaching on justification by faith. However, he found a more positive place for law within the Christian community than did Luther. In Geneva, Calvin was able to experiment with this ideal of a disciplined community of the elect. Calvin also stressed the doctrine of predestination and interpreted Holy Communion as a spiritual partaking of the body and blood of Christ. Calvin's tradition merged eventually with Zwingli's into the Reformed tradition, which was given theological expression by the Second Helvetic Confession of 1561. The Reformation spread to other European countries over the course of the 16th century. Lutheranism dominated Northern Europe. Eastern Europe offered a seedbed for even more radical varieties of Protestantism. Because kings were weak, nobles were strong, and cities were far fewer. Because religious pluralism had long existed in those areas. Spain and Italy were to be the great centers of the Catholic Counter-Reformation, and Protestantism never gained a strong foothold there. In England, the Reformation's roots were both political and religious. Henry VIII, incensed by Pope Clement VII's refusal to grant him an annulment of his marriage, repudiated papal authority, and in 1534 established the Anglican Church, with the king as the supreme head. In spite of its political implications, the reorganization of the Church permitted the beginning of religious change in England, which included the preparation of a liturgy in English, the Book of Common Prayer. In Scotland, John Knox, who spent time in Geneva and was greatly influenced by John Calvin, led the establishment of Presbyterianism, which made possible the eventual union of Scotland with England. Not only was the spiritual world in turmoil, but the social and political fabric of society was being upended as a result of the fractures in the Catholic Church, once the largest political and social influence in people's lives. Revolts sprang up due to the radical beliefs of the reformers. There had been revolts by the peasantry on smaller scales since the 15th century. Luther's pamphlets against the church and the hierarchy, often worded with quote-unquote liberal phraseology, led many peasants to believe he would support an attack on the upper classes in general. Revolts broke out in Franconia, Swabia, and Thuringia in 1524, even drawing support from disaffected nobles, many of whom were in debt. Gaining momentum under the leadership of radicals such as Munzer in Thuringia and others in the southwestern area of modern Germany, the revolts turned into war. The German Peasants' War was Europe's largest and most widespread popular uprising prior to the French Revolution in 1789. The war began with separate insurrections, beginning in the southwest part of what is now Germany and Alsace in France, and spread in subsequent insurrections to the central and eastern areas of Germany and present-day Austria. In mounting their insurrection, peasants faced insurmountable obstacles. The democratic nature of their movement left them without a command structure, and they lacked artillery and cavalry. Most of them had little, if any, military experience. The Swabian League was a mutual defense and peacekeeping association of imperial estates. These were free imperial cities, principalities, and the knights that came with them, in the territory of the medieval Duchy of Swabia, established in 1488. The Swabian League would field the armies to face down the peasants, and they had experienced military leaders, well-equipped and disciplined armies, and ample funding. Martin Luther initially took a middle course in the Peasants' War by criticizing both the injustices imposed on the peasants and the rashness of the peasants in fighting back. He also tended to support the centralization and urbanization of the economy. This position alienated the lesser nobles, but shored up his position with the people of the cities. Luther argued that work was the chief duty on earth. The duty of the peasants was farm labor, and the duty of the ruling classes was upholding the peace. He could not support the peasant war because it broke the peace, an evil he thought greater than the evils the peasants were rebelling against. At the peak of the insurrection in 1525, his position shifted completely in support of the rulers of the secular principalities and the Roman Catholic allies. In his work against the robbing, murderous hordes of peasants, he encouraged the nobility to swiftly and violently eliminate the rebelling peasants, stating, quote, "They must be sliced, choked, stabbed, secretly and publicly by those who can, like one must kill a rabid dog." Unquote. Luther justified his opposition to the rebels on three grounds. First, in choosing violence over lawful submission to the secular government, they were ignoring Christ's counsel to render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's. St. Paul had written in his epistle to the Romans, chapter 13, verses 1 to 7, that all authorities are appointed by God and therefore should not be resisted. This reference from the Bible forms the foundation for the doctrine known as the divine right of kings, or, in the German case, the divine right of the princes. Second, the violent actions of rebelling, robbing, and plundering placed the peasants outside the law of God and empire, according to Martin Luther, so they deserved death in body and soul, if only as highwaymen and murderers. Lastly, Luther charged the rebels with blasphemy for calling themselves Christian brethren and committing their sinful acts under the banner of the gospel. Only later in life did Martin Luther develop the Beowulf concept, permitting some cases of resistance against the government. Thomas Müntzer was the most prominent radical reforming preacher who supported the demands of the peasantry, including political and legal rights. Muntzer's theology had developed against a background of social upheaval and widespread religious doubt, and his call for a new world order fused with the political and social demands of the peasantry. In the final weeks of 1524 and the beginning of 1525, Müntzer traveled to southwest Germany, where the peasant armies were gathering. Here he would have contact with some of their leaders, and it is argued that he also influenced the formation of their demands. Muntzer's role in the peasant war has been the subject of considerable controversy, some arguing that he had no influence at all, others that he was the sole inspirer of the uprising. To judge from his writings of 1523 and 1524, it was by no means inevitable that Müntzer would take the role of social revolutionary. However, it was precisely on this same theological foundation that Muntzer's ideas briefly coincided with the aspirations of the peasants and plebeians of 1525. Viewing the uprising as an apocalyptic act of God, he stepped in as God's servant against the godless and took his position as leader of the rebels. Luther and Müntzer took every opportunity to attack each other's ideas and actions. Luther himself declared against the moderate demands of the peasantry embodied in the 12 Articles, which were written and influenced by Müntzer. His article against the murderous, thieving hordes of peasants appeared in May 1525, just as the rebels were being defeated on the fields of battle. So the peasant movement ultimately failed, resulted in upwards of 100,000 dead peasants, and estimates range for up to 3 times that much, with cities and nobles making a separate peace with the princely armies that restored the old order, in a frequently harsher form, under the nominal control of the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V. The main causes of the failure of the rebellion was the lack of communication between the peasant bands because of territorial divisions and because of their military inferiority. The Swabian League had better grasp of military technology, strategy, and experience. It is interesting to note that the religious revolution of the Protestant Reformation divided the members of the Swabian League, and it would actually be disbanded in 1534. The aftermath of the German Peasants' War led to an overall reduction of rights and freedoms of the peasant class, effectively pushing them out of political life. Certain territories in Upper Swabia, including Kempten, Wesenau, and Tyrol, saw peasants create territorial assemblies, called Landskraft, sit on territorial committees, as well as other bodies, which dealt with issues that directly affected the peasants, such as taxation. However, the overall goals of change for these peasants, particularly looking through the lens of the 12 Articles that they wrote, had failed to come to pass and would remain stagnant, real change coming centuries later. This thread of history is woven across thousands of Mongol-controlled miles, feasting on the backs of plague-riddled traders in Genoa, written in the wills of parents of orphaned children, dropped in plague pits by a decimated Catholic clergy, and hammered into a Wittenberg church door by Martin Luther. The Protestant Reformation is not the end of this thread of history, as the Protestant Reformation also made changes which ripple throughout history. Yersinia pestis caused the death of half of Europe, which caused many orphan children and others to turn to the church for survival, not necessarily for piety, which within a lifetime would lead to corruption so widespread that the theologian and monk Martin Luther would lead a reform movement against indulgences in the Catholic Church, cause the Protestant Reformation, and the associated revolts, conflicts, schisms, executions, and new sects of Christianity. Thank you for listening to Episode 2, The Black Death. This has been Threads of History. I am Mike Shellhammer. Thank you for listening. Listen to more Threads of History on Anchor and Spotify.